Well, it's a great pleasure indeed to be here and be back in Croatia and Zagreb after 9 years, actually, since Hvar in 2006. And I'm very grateful to Grigich of the Institute and to Mary Elise for having me over. So I hope it's worth everyone's while. Now, having proved that I have a coat, I will take it off because it mustn't asphyxiate. I will leave the tie on. Now, the theme of the paper really is the reflection that great philosophers, certainly in the ancient period, Plato, Aristotle, even Plotinus, perhaps with the exception of a man like Epicurus, I think, who was rather dogmatic, were less systematized and therefore dogmatic than their followers. I was just discussing with Professor Zovko now over a schnapps. He's determined that I shan't be quite sober in delivering these talks, but whether that's true perhaps of German philosophers as well, were Kantians more dogmatic than Kant, or Hegelians more dogmatic than Hegel, or let's just say systematized. That mightn't be so obvious, but we agreed that perhaps they were. What happens really is that certainly Plato, I think, is much more interested in pursuing lines of thought and allowing other people to pursue lines of thought than he is just establishing a closed system. Now, not everyone sees him in that way. And indeed, my friends in the Germanic tradition, the Tübingen school, would see a kind of organized secret system that never was written down. But I don't think it worked that way. But yet again, we have a system called Platonism. It's not an entirely uniform system by any means, but it becomes a system. And the point of my lecture today is sort of how that might arise. I hope you mostly have the text, so that's good. The philosopher Plato, as all his friends would agree, was a man of strong views on most subjects. But it's a notable fact that in his published works, he chooses to present these views in a distinctly devious way. The Platonic dialogue, after all, is a literary form designed to advance philosophical positions aporetically and dialectically, not dogmatically. And that there's a school of thought in America particularly, which sort of denies that any doctrines can be derived from the dialogues. It's a position you can take up. If we derive doctrines from them, it is, so to speak, at our own risk. Nonetheless, there's indubitably a body of doctrine associated with the Platonic school. Even within Plato's own lifetime, we have the admittedly tendentious testimony of Aristotle as to the existence of certain philosophical principles of Plato, which he on occasion terms agrapha dogmata, unwritten doctrines, and which have come to be known as the unwritten doctrines. I've taken up a certain position on these myself. That. Seeking to strike a judicious balance between what I regard as the extreme views of Harold Chernus and his followers, which dates back to Schleiermacher indeed, such as Leonardo Turan on the one hand, and the Tübingen school of Conrad Geiser, Hans-Joachim Kramer, and their followers, such as even Giovanni Reale in Milan, on the other. The position of Chernus and many people is that back to the dialogues, stick to the dialogues, try to eliminate, Chernus tries to argue that Aristotle didn't understand Plato. That's improbable. To summarize my position here, I see no problem about there being a body of doctrines, or at least working hypotheses, which do not find their way into the dialogues, except in devious and elusive forms, and that these doctrines, such as that of the derivation of all things from a pair of first principles, a one and an indefinite dyad, should be of basic importance to Plato's system. But I see no need, on the other hand, to hypothesize a full body of secret law present in the Academy from its inception. There's a school of thought that even my friend Christopher Rowe, well, not so much Christopher Rowe, sorry, Charles Kahn, would believe that Plato had the whole system in his head, and he's allowing it out gradually through the dialogues. Anyway, this secret law present in the Academy from its inception, which is preserved as a sort of mystery for the initiated. Short of this, however, it seems to be entirely probable that a great deal of philosophical speculation went on in the Academy, which does not find its way into a dialogue. Actually, my friend Lloyd Gerson has written really a very provocative book, From Plato to Platonism, recently, arguing that the best way to look at Plato's own view is to look at it as a summation of 5 negative principles. And I can never remember them all, but it's anti-nominalism, anti-relativism, anti-materialism, anti-mechanism. I got 4, that's 5. But it's things that you have to be against if you want to be be comfortable in the Academy. But beyond that, you can speculate. At any rate, after all, Plato never promises to reveal his whole mind in writing. Very much the opposite, indeed. And if one bears in mind such a text as Phaedrus 275 DE, or the following notable passage of the 7th letter, 341 CE, which I've put as a handout, whether or not he wrote the letter himself, people knew what they were talking about when they wrote it. But this much I can certainly declare concerning all these writers or prospective writers who claim to know the subjects which I seriously study, perihol ego spudazo, whether as having heard them from me or from others, or as having discovered them themselves. It is impossible, in my judgment at least, that these men should understand anything about this subject. It's really, the context is referring to Dionysius II of Syracuse. There does not exist, nor will there ever exist, any treatise of mine dealing therewith. For it does not at all admit of verbal expression, like other studies, but as a result of continued application to the subject itself, that's through dialectic, and actually living with it, it is brought to birth in the soul all of a sudden, exeifnes, as light that is kindled by a leaping spark, and thereafter it nourishes itself. Well, the new fire continues. Now, even if this is not Plato himself talking, as I say, and I believe it is, it's surely someone who is well acquainted with the situation obtaining in the school. Plato never really gave up on the Socratic idea that philosophy must always be a primarily oral activity, and also an open-ended process. So talk and argumentation prevailed in the groves of the Academy. And the members of the Academy of whom we have any knowledge, figures such as Speusippus, Xenocrates, Aristotle, Eudoxus of Cnidos, or Heraclides of Pontus, were a pretty talkative and argumentative bunch. Not the sort of people to sit around mute as cigar store Indians until Plato had completed another dialogue. Well, that's a rather American analogy, but outside cigar stores in the old United States, there was a large Indian chief carved sitting. You wouldn't get that now. At any rate, whatever the status of these unwritten doctrines, we are, it seems to me, left with the interesting problem that from the perspective of the later Platonist tradition, beginning with Antiochus of Ascalon in the 1st century BC, a firm conviction arose that Plato of the Old Academy had put forth a consistent and comprehensive body of doctrine on all aspects of philosophy. And this belief continued throughout later antiquity. Not that Platonism was ever seen to be a monolithic structure. There was room for a wide spectrum of positions on most ethical and physical questions. But there was a solid consensus that Plato did dogmatize, and did not, as the new academicians from Arcesilaus to Carneades maintained, simply raise problems or suspend judgment. Well, the skeptical academy of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC were a problem for the rest of the tradition. It's a question, did you reject them completely as an aberration, or did you try to salvage them in some way? And there's a balance about those, which is a very interesting subject which we won't go into now. What I'd like to inquire into on this occasion is, A, whether there might be any justification for this belief that there was dogma, and B, if there is, at what stage might this dogmatism have arisen? It seems to me best in approaching this question to start at the end, so to speak, that is, with the evidence of Antiochus, and work back. What we find with Antiochus, or rather in a number of significant texts of Cicero, in which his spokespersons are expounding Platonic doctrine along Antiochian lines, I mean, there are endless layers, well, not endless, but considerable layers of problem in reconstructing the views of all the people I'm concerned with, because Antiochus we don't have a line of, really. We have large slabs of Cicero, which probably are him. Anyway, what we find in Antiochus is, first of all, a clear division of the subject matter of philosophy into the 3 domains of ethics, physics, including what we'd consider rather metaphysics, or the discussion of first principles, and logic, and then a set of confidently proclaimed doctrines under each of those heads. It's long been assumed without much dissent that this construction is very largely a fantasy of Antiochus's, concocted by the dint of extrapolating back onto his heroes in the old academy, a body of doctrines largely gleaned from the Stoics, by whose teachings he was deeply influenced. Well, that I hope we've put to rest generally, but it hasn't been entirely put to rest. My old friend Jonathan Barnes, in his typically unreasonable way, would like to maintain that Antiochus was inventing most of this, and that people like myself are guilty of elevating a very insignificant person into a very great philosopher indeed, as he says. But that's his problem. I entered a plea against this assumption in the Middle Platonists some 30, 40 years ago now, arguing on the one hand that there was little point in Antiochus trying to put over on a fairly skeptical and well-informed public a claim for which there was no justification whatever, and on the other hand recalling how little we really know of doctrinal developments within the old academy, especially under the leadership of Xenocrates and Polemon. Well, one thing I pointed out is that Cicero, who likes to feel on the whole that he remains true to the new academy, never accuses Antiochus of inventing, which he well could have if he wished. He accuses them of being excessively Stoic, but and twisting things a bit. But he doesn't say what, say, Jonathan Barnes would say, and he knew better than Barnes. So anyway, I was still, however, in the Middle Platonists, pretty wary of attributing too much in the way of doctrine to Polemon in particular, since we seem to know so little about him, despite his nearly, I was saying 40-year tenure, but he wasn't there. He was more like 30-something years tenure of the headship, but it's a pretty long period to be the head of the academy. But since then, I've been much encouraged by a most perceptive article of David Sedley's The Origins of Stoic God, published in 2002, goes back a bit now, which seems to me opens the way to recovering much of Polemon's doctrinal position. And I've rather taken the ball and run with it in chapter 4 of The Heirs of Plato. I'll return to David Sedley's article presently, but for the present I want to concentrate rather on the topic of ethics. And even before that, to focus on the question of the formal division of philosophy into topics at all, because that arose somewhere, which seems to me to be bound up with the establishment of the philosophical system. We learn from Sextus Empiricus, late 2nd century AD, in fact, against the logicians 116, that the first philosopher formally to distinguish the 3 main areas or topics of philosophy, which Sextus names in the order physics, ethics, logic, but which can occur in virtually any order, was Xenocrates. However, and I think significantly, Sextus precedes this announcement by saying that Plato himself had already made this division virtually, the aname, since he discussed many problems in all these fields. And in fact, he could have added that Aristotle implicitly recognizes this division at the beginning of the topics, 1.14. So it's around. Not necessarily before Xenocrates, I suppose, but implicitly. The true significance of this statement of Sextus is, I think, that Xenocrates himself, in making this formal division, sought to father the concept on Plato himself, possibly in his attested work on philosophy. One of our problems is we don't have a single line of Xenocrates, although he wrote many works. He could, after all, without difficulty, have adduced various passages from the dialogues, and indeed whole dialogues, such as the Timaeus for physics, Republic 4 for ethics, or the Theaetetus for epistemology as a part of logic, or indeed the second part of the Parmenides in the same connection, which would support his contention very much as is done by later composers of Platonist handbooks, such as Alcinous or Apuleius. If this be so, it can be seen as the tip of a rather large iceberg. First of all, in order to make appeal to the works of Plato, one needed to have a definitive edition of them. And this is shrouded in mystery. How was the corpus put together? It was the suggestion long ago of Henri Aline, back in 1915, that the first edition of the works of Plato was instituted in the Academy under Xenocrates. And although this has been much impugned over the years as unprovable, I must say it seems to me an entirely probable conjecture. Such an early edition was certainly made, since we have what appears to be Plato's entire oeuvre surviving to us, something that cannot be claimed for any other ancient philosophic author, except perhaps Plotinus, and we know how that happened, because Porphyry tells us. And I feel it is to be unlikely that Speusippus ever got around to such an enterprise. It would most effectively underpin what seems to have been Xenocrates' main project, which is that of defending the tradition of Platonism against the attacks of Aristotle and his associates across town, such as Theophrastus, who devoted quite a lot of his energies to his history of philosophy, really. Since to perform this duty plausibly, he needed to have the master's works at hand in a definitive format. Once he had an authoritative corpus, he could proceed. Now, we don't know what order he arranged these in, because the later orders of tetralogies and trilogies, even in the Hellenistic period under with Eratosthenes, are not attested for this period. We don't know anything about it. But he must have arranged them either chronologically or thematically, in a way that sort of presupposes the later divisions. Anyway, he could proceed. Though I think also that he had no hesitation in appealing to unwritten doctrines when required, relying not only on his personal experience of what went on in the Academy, but on such a text as that from the seventh letter quoted above, if he did not actually compose that himself. One suggestion is that the seventh letter was put together by a committee of the Old Academy, which would make it not much less authoritative. His purpose will have been to hammer out something like a coherent body of doctrines from this rather unpromising material. Now, if we take the sphere of ethics for a start, the sort of issues that were arising in the wake of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, in whatever form that might have been available, would have been the relative importance of the virtues and the lesser goods, those of the body and of external circumstances, in the achieving of happiness, or eudaimonia, which of course we only translate happiness with some caution, and the overall purpose of life, whether theoria or praxis. From Plato himself, one might derive rather mixed signals, after all. From the Phaedo, for instance, one might conclude that the concerns of the body are simply a distraction for the philosopher, and it should be unhitched from as far as possible, even before death. The philosopher should precisely practice death. Whereas from the Republic, and particularly Book 9, One might deduce that the lesser goods, desired by the spirited element, the thumos, and the passionate element, epithymia, though far inferior to the goods of the soul, are to be accorded a limited status in a suitably controlled and moderated form. This ambiguity continues in the Laws, where in Book 1, 631 BC, we learn that goods are of two kinds, human and divine, and the human goods are dependent on the divine, and he who receives the greater acquires also the less, or else he is bereft of both. Well, that implies that the lower goods are necessary for the good life, for happiness. These human goods, such as health, beauty, strength, and wealth, Plato goes on to say, are far inferior to the divine goods of the soul, which are the four virtues, but they are not to be dismissed from consideration. He goes on to characterize them, however, somewhat later in Book 2 as conditional goods, which are really good only for the virtuous man, and actually evils for the bad man, who will be liable to misuse them. But of course, that's reasonably obvious. Great beauty or great wealth can be used very evilly, if there's no virtue there. In face of all this, let's consider the definitions of happiness put forth by Xenocrates and Polemon, respectively, as relayed to us by the Alexandrian church father Clement. Now again, so we're dependent on third-hand, fourth-hand information, doxographic reports in Book 2 of the Stromates. First, that of Xenocrates, presumably derived from his treatise on happiness. Since he wrote a treatise on happiness, remotely it would be derived from that. Xenocrates of Chalcedon defines happiness as the acquisition of the excellence, arete, virtue, proper to us, and of the resources with which to service it. You can't be generous, Aristotle would point out, if you don't have anything to give away. Then, as regards the proper seat, to enho, the in what of this, he plainly says the soul. As to the motive cause of it, the huf hu, that's by which, he identifies the virtues. As the material cause, ex hoc, material causes, in the sense of parts, noble actions and good habits and attitudes, hexes kadiatheses. So the practices of the virtues are the building blocks of excellence. And his indispensable accompaniments, honuganu, let's say those things without which you will not attain happiness, bodily and external goods. So they are there. First of all, can we conclude from this that the distinctive metaphysic of propositions, which I've just outlined there, presumed by such an authority as Willi Tyler to be the product of the scholasticism of the 1st century BCE, or later, is already being utilized by Xenocrates at the end of the 4th century. This is a rather technical point, but I'm not sure why not, really. There's nothing inherent in the formulation, it's just the use of prepositions with relative pronouns that couldn't have been derived from a scholastically minded man from the existing, somewhat less systematic use of prepositions for this purpose by Plato and Aristotle. And I'm not sure how or why Clement would have arrived at this application of the prepositional terms had he not had some stimulus to it from Xenocrates. Well, perhaps I'm being a little optimistic there. There could have been other hands processing this information. But more importantly, however, is the content of the doctrine. We can deduce from this, I think, that the eudaimonia, happiness, is for Xenocrates not solely a matter of the acquisition or possession of arete, spiritual excellence, but the resources with which to service it. That is to say, the bodily and external goods, which are its honugano, which I've rendered its indispensable accompaniments. This in turn may be connected with evidence that can be derived from Cicero in the Book 4 of the De Finibus, 15 to 18, where in Confutation of the Stoics he's presenting the Antiochian view of the doctrine of the old academy and Peripatos, or more specifically of Xenocrates and Aristotle. Antiochus likes to link the two of them as authoritative for the old academy, because one of his arguments is that the school of Aristotle does not disagree with Plato in most important facts, which again is a pretty optimistic, but that's his position. After declaring that these two start out from the same ethical first principles as do the Stoics later, the first things according to nature, or the utorak the prima naturae in Cicero's Latin, he proceeds to give a summary of their positions. As this account does not accord particularly well with Aristotle's surviving views, though it may have accorded better with early works of his available to Cicero, it's a knotty question which I've had to write a chapter on recently for a forthcoming volume on Cicero's Aristotle. What did he have access to? But we won't go into that at the moment. But many works he had access to are not available to us. It seems reasonable, anyway, to claim it broadly for Xenocrates. Every natural organism aims at being its own preserver, so as to secure its safety and also its preservation true to its specific type, in its best, according to its type. So, omnis natura vult esse conservatrix sui, ut et salvasit, it should be preserved, et in genere conservator suo, it doesn't want to change into another genus. That's a very basic principle. With this object, they declare, man is called in the aid of the arts to assist nature. And chief among these is counted the art of living, well, the arts and crafts, you might say, sort of agriculture and things like that, which helps him to guard the gifts that nature has bestowed and to obtain those that are lacking. They further divided the nature of man into soul and body. Well, they certainly did that. Each of these parts they pronounced to be desirable for its own sake. Because again, Aristotle would divide the soul from the body, but he doesn't wish the soul to be an independent entity in the surviving works. So each is desirable for its own sake, and consequently they said that the virtues or excellences also of each were desirable for their own sakes. At the same time, they extolled the soul as infinitely surpassing the body in worth, and accordingly placed the virtues also of the mind above the goods of the body. But they held that wisdom is the guardian and protectress of the whole man, as being the comrade and helper of nature. And so they said that the function of wisdom, as protecting a being that consisted of a mind and a body, was to assist and preserve him in respect of both. Now this is all polemical against the Stoics, because Antiochus accuses the Stoics, and in particular Chrysippus, of behaving as if we were a mind without a body. The principle with which this passage begins does not admittedly seem to reflect closely anything appearing in the Platonic dialogues. But it could well be a development of a principle enunciated by Plato's companion Eudoxus of Cnidus, who was noted for maintaining that pleasure was the highest good, on the grounds that the maximization of pleasure was the first thing sought by any sentient organism from its birth on. Well, now this would seem a very un-Platonic sort of thought, but it depends what you mean by pleasure. And because at the earliest, lowest stage of the animal's development, the human baby, as well as small animals, simply they want milk, they want to survive, they want, you might say, pleasure. And as Aristotle tells us rather nicely, since Eudoxus was a person of irreproachable personal behavior himself, this added weight to his argument. But actually, I was delivering that passage in a slightly different context just a few years ago, and we had an interesting discussion in the audience. But I was saying, it's funny you shouldn't be able to come up with anything from Plato. And somebody said very wisely, how about the symposium? How about Diotima's basic principle in the symposium, which is in 207d, to the effect that the mortal does all it can to put on immortality. What her argument is, we're striving for immortality as best we can, and human beings try to produce a spurious immortality by generating offspring. But of course the philosophical human being generates spiritual offspring, which is a higher form of offspring. But Diotima produces this thought, and that might have been a thought that could be generalized and kicked around in the oral discussions of the academy. Can we postulate a basic urge in the human being, in any animal, to preserve itself, which then can be progressively refined? That's the Stoics agreed with that, and they felt they could refine it too. Anyway, the principle with which this passage begins doesn't admittedly seem to sorry, we've done that. If so, Xenocrates has adapted this thought of Eudoxus, if that was what he's adapting, to a rather different purpose, to establish a justification for maintaining a concern for physical survival and comfort as a base on which to build. On the other hand, the sentiments expressed in the rest of the text are readily derivable from the passage of the laws mentioned above. So it's a respectable Platonic principle, I think. The establishing of the things primary according to nature, that's to proto-cataphusia, as the basis for an ethical theory is attributed by Antiochus also to Polemon in, again, the passage of De Finibus 4. But we may discern from reports of his position a slight increase in austerity in comparison with his master Xenocrates, and would not expect Polemon to disagree with Xenocrates very much, but he does seem to have moved a little in the direction of maintaining the self-sufficiency of virtue. It's interesting. It can only have been slight, as they are consistently lumped together in the doxography, not least by Antiochus. But it's significant that Polemon was the teacher of the future Stoic founder Zeno. Just remember that there is that personal connection of the Stoic school with the late academy. And he plainly transmitted to him an austere ethical stance, which Zeno then developed further. A lot of early Stoicism, one can see, is a formalization, again, of academic doctrine, things that were fuzzy. Clement reports Polemon's position immediately following that of Xenocrates as follows. Polemon, the associate of Xenocrates, seems to wish happiness, eudaimonia, to consist in self-sufficiency, autarkeia, in respect of all good things, or at least the most and greatest of them. For he lays it down that happiness can never be achieved apart from virtue, while virtue is sufficient for happiness even if bereft of bodily and external goods. Now, it looks like Xenocrates would not say that. He said it needs an underpinning of some minimal health, not wealth, but support and so on and so forth, demand. It's this last specification, if in anything, that Polemon is distinctive. One can see here, I think, traces of an ongoing argument within the academy as to the precise status of the so-called mortal goods, which Plato himself rather disparages by calling them mortal goods. Nevertheless, it would seem from Antiochus' evidence that Polemon didn't entirely dismiss these lower goods. Here's the passage alluded to above, 4, De Finibus 4, 50-1. Cicero is in the position of criticizing Cato, who is a Stoic, for indulging in various specious Stoic arguments. As for your other argument, it's by no means consequential, but actually dull-witted to a degree, though of course the Stoics, and not you yourself, are responsible for that, so he's being polite to Cato. Happiness, they say, is a thing to be proud of, but it cannot be the case that anyone should have good reason to be proud without virtue. So you don't be proud of anything that is not virtue. The former proposition, Polemon will concede to Zeno. Happiness is a thing to be proud of. And so will his master, that's Xenocrates, and the whole of their school, as well as all the other philosophers who, while ranking virtue far above all else, yet couple some other thing with it in defining the highest good. Since if virtue is a thing to be proud of, as it is, and excels everything else to a degree hardly to be expressed in words, Polemon will be able to be happy if endowed solely with virtue and destitute of all besides. And yet he will not grant you that nothing except virtue is to be reckoned as a good. So this is where he stops short of Stoicism. We have here then the lineaments of a Platonist doctrine on the first principles of ethics and the components of happiness, which, while allowing for variations of emphasis, yet can form the basis for a coherent position. In later times, it rather depended on whether you were more concerned to combat Stoics, up to the 2nd century AD, so, as for example was Plutarch, or Peripatetics, as was the later Athenian Platonist Atticus. that you took a more or less austere line in ethics, that you favoured, for example, metriopatheia, which is the moderation of the passions, over apatheia, which is the extirpation of the passions, or the reverse. But in either case, there was a positive Platonist doctrine to fall back on, and that doctrine, I would maintain, was laid down by Xenocrates and Polemon, not immediately by Plato. So there, say, one can see variations within the old academic position, but within the parameters of a doctrine. That's their doctrine on ethics, or the end of life, or happiness, and the role of the lower goods. Now, we can consider a bit of first principles of physics. The case is rather similar in the area of the first principles of physics. Plato had left a rather confusing legacy to his successors, or so it must seem to us. We have on the one hand the good of the Republic, a first principle which is in some way beyond the rest of existence, although there's a slight ambiguity about that. It's beyond ousia existence in dunamis and, what was it, dunameikai, exousia. But an old friend of mine, Matthias Baltus, has argued that that doesn't mean that it's beyond being. It was certainly taken as that in later times. But that's the good, which is a fairly impersonal entity, although it's powerful in obviously creating the rest of existence. Anyway, it's the first principle, which is in some way beyond the rest of existence, of which it is the generative ground, as well as an object of desire. So things do strive towards the good. But then there is the demiurge of the Timaeus, who is described as an intellect, but who is represented as contemplating a model, a paradigma, in some way above and beyond himself. It's in the, if you take the myth of the Timaeus literally, the paradigm is quite independent of the demiurge, which just means craftsman. He's modeling the world on the basis of this paradigm. So the company model in some way, in his creation of soul and of the world, unless the demiurge and his creation are a myth, of course, and to be deconstructed, as was stoutly maintained against the criticisms of Aristotle by both Speusippus and Xenocrates. This is the most extraordinary discussion or disagreement within a generation of Plato himself among his chief followers. Is the Timaeus to be taken literally or not? Then there's the one of the hypotheses of the second part of the Parmenides, which may or may not have been intended by Plato as a first principle, but which was certainly taken as such in later times. We don't know when that started. I mean, I think it went back to Speusippus, but that'd be a little controversial. Now, a little further, there are the first principles set out in the Philebus, 26c following. Limit the unlimitedness, the unlimited, and the cause of the mixture, which seem to have a fairly close relationship to the one in the indefinite dyad of the unwritten doctrines. And then, last but not least, we seem to have a doctrine firmly enunciated first in the Phaedrus, 245c following, a very interesting sort of passage which stylistically imitates pre-Socratic treatises, but which is also dominant in Book 10 of the Laws, of a rational world soul as the first principle of all motion, and therefore of all creation. What are we to do with this embarrassment of riches? It's fairly plain what Xenocrates did with it. It's less plain in the case of Polemon, but I think that his position is recoverable if certain minimal clues are probed closely. In either case, the result is interesting. I've left out Speusippus. He is very interesting, but he's not. I'm not maintaining that he first established a dogma. In the case of Xenocrates, what's attested, though only by the doxographer Aetius, who is a rather doubtful witness, I said I've had a certain amount to say about him, is a pair of monad and dyad, the former being characterized as Zeus and Od, in the numerical sense, peritos, and intellect, nous, and spoken of in addition as having the role of father, reigning in the heavens, which latter description seems to connect him remarkably with the Zeus of the Phaedrus myth, 246e, and to place him not in any transcendent relation to the physical cosmos, but rather as resident in the topmost sphere of it, which is sounds a rather un-Platonic position, but it seems to have been toyed with by members of the Old Academy and later. In respect of his consort, however, there is what seems to me a serious difficulty in the text, which I've had various stabs at solving over the years, but which still bothers me. Here's the text as it appears in the placata, in the list of the views of the philosophers. It was really in pseudo-Plutarch, but it's referred back to Aetius. Xenocrates, son of Agathenor of Chalcedon, holds as gods. This is a little passage which actually ultimately occurs in, it's in Stobaeus, John Stobaeus, way in the 4th century AD. And Stobaeus has a passage near the beginning of his work on what is the nature of God, according to various philosophers. That is to say, the supreme God. So Xenocrates holds as the monad and dyad. The former is male, having the role of father, reigning in the heavens, en urano basiliousan, which he terms Zeus, and Od, peritos, and intellect, which is for him the primary god. The other as female in the manner of the mother of the gods, metros theon dikein, curious use of dikein, ruling over the realm below the heavens, who is for him the soul of the universe, psyche to pantos. Now, yes, here on the face of it, it seems that the female principle, which is the counterpart of the monad, while being characterized as the mother of the gods, which puts her very senior to even Zeus, is also presented as a world soul whose realm of operations is below the heavens. Now, I'm on record as declaring that either Aetius has gone seriously astray here, or the manuscript tradition has suffered corruption. You could leave out the whole line. My reason for maintaining that is that we learn also from the rather more reliable source that is Plutarch, in his treatise on the creation of the soul of the Timaeus, that when Xenocrates is interpreting the creation of the soul of the Timaeus, 35 AB, let's say that it's mixed from the moving and that which is distributed by bodies. He takes the indivisible substance, the ameristhasousia, which is one component of the soul, as being in fact the monad, and that which is divided about bodies, hyperithasomata meriste, as multiplicity, plethos, or the indefinite dyad, while the soul, characterized as a self-moving number, is the product of these two. So the indefinite dyad cannot be the world soul, as one generally supposes. Anyway, I'd like to think that what's happened is that a line has fallen out of the Aetius passage between metros theon, that's of the mother of the gods, and dikein, in which we learned that the dyad was female, and I've invented a line, holding the rank of mother of the gods, which he terms Rhea, which is the name of the mother of the gods, and even, because you want to balance peritos with artios, even number, and matter, with balancing nous. While dikein actually could be taken as a proper name, Dike, the assessor of Zeus in Hesiod's works and days. Dike, justice, sits beside him. And his follower in Laws, Book 4, 716a, which is a famous passage, characterizing the world soul as the offspring of these two entities, rather like Athena, who may also be mentioned. Athena springing from the brow of Zeus. This would at any rate provide us with a coherent account of Xenocrates' system of first principles, which in turn can be seen as an attempt to bring some order into the Platonic Testimonia. But it also emphasizes the difficulties in trying to derive the doctrines of the Old Academy from the evidence available, which is why people generally didn't try to do that. if we can take this as being the position, we can see, I think, Xenocrates is going to work to create a coherent Platonist doctrine to counter the attacks of Aristotle, particularly on the heavens, De Caelo 1:12. An important part of his strategy, that's where Aristotle mocks Plato, really, for suggesting that something could be created on the one hand, the world, and be eternal at the other, in the other direction, which is illogical. But Plato says that, that of course the world should be destructible because it has been created, but by the will of the demiurge it will continue. Aristotle says, you can't say that. An important part of Aristotle's strategy is insisting on, of Xenocrates' strategy, is insisting on a non-literal interpretation of the Timaeus, since a literal interpretation creates various major embarrassments, which indeed Aristotle picked on. Well, my argument about Aristotle is that he knew perfectly well what Plato may have in mind, but Aristotle has a dialectical principle when he's criticizing. He says, apropos of his advice in the rhetoric about law cases, always pick on the least favorable interpretation of your opponent's remarks, even if you know he didn't mean that. It's a good principle in legal proceedings, and I think he's quite prepared to pursue that. He said, if he said it, he's liable for it. And Plato said it. The first problem, anyway, is the inconsistency of postulating something, to wit, the physical cosmos, that has a beginning, but by arbitrary decree of the demiurge, no end. That is a logical absurdity, but there is also the difficulty of the demiurge, though he appears to be a supreme deity, nonetheless contemplating a paradigma or model in accordance with which he performs his creative work, which is independent of and coordinate with himself. And there's also the oddity, though it's explained away by ingenious feats of modern exegesis, that although Timaeus has stated that an intellect cannot be present in anything without a soul, 30b 2-3, the demiurge is precisely that, an intellect without a soul, because he hasn't created a soul yet. Now you could say, well, he's an intellect, he's not in anything, but yeah, the demiurge in the myth is a person, and he thinks and so on. He should have a soul. However, once one has postulated that the account of demiurgic creation is a myth, all these problems dissolve satisfactorily. What seems to have happened, we only have again a scholiast, sort of late antique scholastic comment on Aristotle, that Speusippus and Xenocrates declared that the myth, that the Timaeus was not to be taken literally, but was only set out for purposes of exposition. So they must have called a press conference and announced this. But there's no reason to doubt that was where the long Platonic tradition of non-literal interpretation of the Timaeus begins. So once one has postulated the account of demiurgic creation as a myth, all these problems dissolve satisfactorily. What the demiurge then becomes, it seems to me, is nothing other than a divine intellect contemplating its own contents, or you could say a rational world soul, actually, stretching a point. His own contents, which are the totality of the forms. And this is how later Platonists saw it. He was looking at the forms are his thoughts, conceived by this stage as numbers, or at least numerical formulae of some sort, and projecting them eternally onto a substratum, which Plato himself notoriously doesn't present as matter, but which Aristotle and very probably both Speusippus and Xenocrates also did. Well, hule is a term that arises in Aristotle rather than Plato, although Speusippus seems to use it. So it's floating around. And there's still an argument as to whether the receptacle of the Timaeus is properly prime matter. Aristotle thought it was. This is also the Zeus of the Phaedrus myth, and perhaps also the good of the Republic. This is this principle. What, however, of the world soul of Lords 10, which would seem to be Plato's last word on the subject of supreme principles? It is not entirely clear to me what's going on here, and I'm not sure that Polemon may not have had a slightly different take on it from Xenocrates. But I'd suggest that for Plato in the Laws, Supreme principles are indeed still the one and the indefinite dyad, but they're seen as somehow, when considered separately, only potential principles, and I'm kind of inventing here, which must come together to be actualized. And the result of that, their coming together, is the generation, first of the whole system of forms, form numbers, and then with the addition of the principle of mobility of soul. This is borrowing from Speusippus, actually. Since this whole process must be conceived of as being eternal and indeed timeless, the actively cosmogonic principle and the cause of motion to everything else is in fact the world soul, a rational world soul. At any rate, that is one version of a system of first principles that is bequeathed to later generations of Platonists in the form of a triad of God, forms, or sometimes described as just form, ethea, and matter. And this goes back, I suggest, primarily to Xenocrates, who, however, was assiduous in fathering it on Plato, and was able to quote a number of proof texts in support of this. That is not, however, the only system that emerges from the Old Academy, and this brings me back to Polemon and to David Sedley. We've long had the problem, and it was one that bothered me when I was surveying the Old Academy in the first chapter of the Middle Platonist, and for a long time after that, that although Polemon presided over the Academy for, let's say, almost 40 years, I'm a bit optimistic there, and was a deeply respected figure, all we seem to know of him, apart from a cluster of anecdotes and sayings, sort of at the level of popular philosophy, was a modicum of ethical theory. He didn't seem to have any views on physics or logic at all. And yet how could that be true? How could one profess to be a Platonist and head of the Academy, after all, and disregard the whole metaphysical structure to underlay Plato's ethical theories? Certainly Antiochus' spokesman Varro, in a passage of Cicero's Academica, 1:24-9, gives us what purports to be a survey of old academic physics, but it comes across as so palpably stoic in content that no one gave it a second thought. Thought, this is Antiochus just inventing. However, one small clue does exist to Polemon's doctrine in this area, which if properly pressed can yield interesting results. And it was this that David Sedley fastened on in his article, The Origins of Stoic God. Immediately following on Aetius' rather extensive report of Xenocrates' theology, he appends a single line. Polemon declared that the cosmos is God. Polemon ton cosmon theon apatheneton. There were some who noted this doxographic snippet without finding it very interesting, as they felt that it could be rendered, Polemon declared the cosmos is ego, which would be a fairly uninteresting piece of information. Obviously it was God. But in the context, it cannot mean that. Aetius is presenting various philosophers' views about the supreme deity. Let's say Stobaeus, not about any old god. So we're faced with the testimony, albeit baldly doxographic, that for Polemon, Platonist though he was, the supreme principle is none other than the cosmos. How could that be so? This is very Stoic. We must first of all, I suggest, think back to Plato's last thoughts on the subject in Laws 10, and more particularly to his faithful secretary, his amanuensis, Philip of Opus's appendix to that work, the Epinomis. But I say that rather boldly. That's disputed, but I think, having studied the Epinomis at some length, that's what it is. It's a pastiche of Plato in the best late style, pushing Philip's particular interpretation of them. Philip in the Epinomis, 976d, 981b and e, comes out unequivocally in support of the position that the supreme principle is a rational world soul immanent in the cosmos, and indeed that the study of astronomy, not dialectic now, astronomy is the highest science, since one is in fact thereby studying the motions of the divine mind. Philip had presumably convinced himself that this was indeed Plato's final view on the question. But he's actually presenting a rather radical take on Plato's thought, which was plainly not shared by his colleagues Speusippus or Xenocrates. Polemon, I would suggest, may have been attracted by it. But if indeed one adopts this view of the active first principle, what follows for one's doctrine of the dynamic structure of the cosmos? as a whole. Let's consider Antiochus' account of the old Academy's physical theory. The topic of nature, as physis, this goes back to Cicero and Varro, which they treated next after ethics, they approached by dividing it into two principles. The one, the creative, poietike, which is efficiens, the other at this one's disposal, as it were, out of which something might be created. In the creative one, they considered that there inhered power, dunamis, vis. In the one acted upon, a sort of matter, materia, vile. Yet they held that each of the two inhered in the other, for neither would matter have been able to cohere if it were not held together by any power, nor yet would the power without some matter. For nothing exists without being necessarily somewhere. The power has to act in a place which is matter. That seems to me to be a reference back to the Timaeus 52a, B. Everything that exists must necessarily be in some place, in tine topo. But that which was the product of both they called body, corpus, soma, and so to speak, a sort of quality, a poiotes, qualitas. What we have here is a two-principle universe, admittedly very similar to that of the Stoics, but it's also interestingly similar to that attributed to Plato himself by Theophrastus in his curious little work, The Metaphysics. These two principles can, after all, be taken as the one and the indefinite dyad, or limit and the unlimited, neither of which can exist without the other, and the union of which generates first number and soul, but ultimately the cosmos. Even the denominating of the active principle as a dunamis, and the formal principle, for that's what's being referred to as poiotes, could be seen as deriving from a scholastic exegesis of Theaetetus. First of 156a, where Socrates refers to active and passive principles in the cosmos as dunamis, could mean, of course, a power and a potency, a potentiality. And then to 182a, where he coins the term poiotes, as far as we can see. And of course, there was an etymologizing connection between poiotes and poieo, to act, to do something, create something. So even if we were driven to admit that Antiochus is giving something of a Stoic gloss to this material here, it seems reasonable to argue that he can't have done so without some warrant from the old academic sources available to him. A little further on, in sections 27 to 8, the active principle is identified as a rational world soul, residing primarily in the heavens, but pervading all parts of the cosmos. It's in this sense that the cosmos as a whole can be described as God. It is perfect intelligence and wisdom, mens sapientiaque perfecta, which they call God, and is a sort of providence, presiding over all things that fall under its control. There's nothing here, I think, that can't be derived from a non-literal interpretation of the Timaeus. We can see then, I think, in the case of ethical theory, something of a difference of emphasis between the doctrinal positions of Xenocrates and Polemon, though without constituting anything like a contradiction. The first beneficiaries of Polemon's doctrinal stance were the Stoics, but he then became available to such figures as Eudorus of Alexandria, Nero's court philosopher Thrasyllus, and even the Platonizing Jewish philosopher Philo, all of whom adopted a rather stoicizing logos theology, while other philosophers, such as Plutarch and Atticus, will have been more influenced by Xenocrates. Between the two of them, however, they provided the basis for a body of Platonist dogma. Well, we're almost at an end. I will pass lightly over the topic of logical theory and epistemology, since really most later Platonists adopted as Platonic the whole Aristotelian system of logic, together with such innovations as were added by Theophrastus and his successors. The old academic system of division of all things into categories of absolute and relative was not entirely forgotten, but relegated rather to the background. The section of the Academica, at 132, devoted to logic, though, is not without interest and indicates that Polemon was not oblivious to that either. I can also go on in considerably more detail into the areas of ethics and physics, but I hope that enough has been said here to make my point, which is that the exigencies of inter-school rivalry, initially between the Academy and the Peripetos, I mean, Xenocrates had to say at a certain point, what do we believe? What is our position? But then between later Platonists and the Stoics and Aristotelians, demanded that Platonism become more formalized than it was left by Plato himself, and it was primarily Xenocrates, in a vast array of treatises, both general and particular, who provided the bones of this organized corpus of doctrine. Not that the Platonists were ever subject to anything like monolithic orthodoxy. Platonic doctrine was not anything handed down centrally from above. It was rather a self-regulating system in which everybody knew what it meant broadly to be a Platonist, which could in later times embrace being a Pythagorean as well. I often got into that. And managed to stay within those parameters while squabbling vigorously with each other, as well as with other schools. Thanks.